feel very honored to be here and presenting about the Khipu model as a metaphor that has helped me to develop this indigenous research framework. First of all, I should say, I would like to acknowledge the peoples of this land, the Narragansett people. Also, I would like to acknowledge the Andean people who are my ancestors back in Peru, and also the Maori people of Aotearoa, New Zealand, which has become my home and my friends and allies over the past 20 years. Mantakani, Peru, Sutimi Mariaelena, Tenakoto, Tenakoto, Tenakoto Katou. I just greeted you in the Quechua language of my ancestors and also in the language of the Maori people. Welcome and thank you for coming to my presentation today. As Bob mentioned, I'm working on a book project entitled Global Indigeneity, Sustainability and Food Politics. And today I'm going to talk specifically about the research methods of my research and how I came to develop the Khipu model as an innovative research framework, honoring the voices of the ancestors. My presentation has three main sections. First, I want to talk about why I became so involved in designing the Khipu as an indigenous research framework. How does the Khipu work? Why I use the Khipu as a metaphor. I'm going to explain about how I developed the Khipu, and finally, we will have time to discuss more and have a nice discussion at the end of the presentation, and about drinks as well. And so today, without any further ado, I'm going to talk about, why I wanted to develop the Khipu model. For me, being born in Peru, raised in Lima, and then traveling to New Zealand at a very young age has exposed me to this cross-cultural experience, learning about the Maori people, the culture, knowing and understanding about indigenous ways of knowing and being. Then going back to Peru and traveling all throughout the country, I became aware that there is a disconnection between how knowledge is understood and practiced in Aotearoa and how knowledge has been produced in Quechua communities. Traveling throughout the highlands of Peru, I started working with Quechua communities. And their struggles and their discontent when it comes to research was expressed to me in different examples. And they mentioned to me, we are very tired of having another researcher. I was traveling, trying to find a topic for my research. I'm talking, this picture's back in 2009, 2010, so it's been 8 years. I'm still working with them. And they mentioned to me, well, there are many researchers that come, appropriate the knowledge, and they leave. But we're trying to find ways to preserve our knowledge. And those discussions led me to think, how come it's different in New Zealand? How come we have in New Zealand established indigenous research framework named Kapapa Maori? How it's different in Peru? And then they even told me, when they come and ask, for instance, about how many medicinal plants we have, I tell them we have 20. And with a chicken in tongue, they told me, but we have more than 20. So that sort of understanding about how they're trying to preserve the knowledge and its passive-aggressive attitude has led me to think hard about the research and the research methods I want to adopt when it comes to my research with the Quechua and Māori communities. I went back to New Zealand. I started working on the literature review. I didn't take the comments lightly. I took them and I regard them highly. And this is when I started studying more about the discourse about indigenous methodologies, Western methodologies. I have this insider knowledge, having an indigenous heritage, and also an outsider knowledge because I am trained in Western academia. When it comes to Western research paradigms, I've been trained in qualitative methods. As Bob mentioned, I come from I have an international business degree. I come from the University of Auckland, where I was actually very privileged to be working with Maori scholars who has been very fundamental in inspiring and developing the Khipu model. Western worldviews are a set of worldviews clustered on norms and beliefs, stemming from a Western perspective. Worldviews, or the concept of worldviews, as described by many anthropologists from early anthropology working with native communities, the Apostle, Levi-Strauss, some more contemporary, such as Margaret Mead, they have described that worldviews, it's, in a nutshell, it's a mental lens entrenched on how you see the world. And it's embedded on values and beliefs. That frames a Western research paradigm. So you have this Western research paradigm and go and conduct research with indigenous communities, you will find it disconnect because it's based on a Western worldviews. Now, if we think about indigenous worldviews, by the way, the other ways of knowing, and these other ways of knowing is indigenous knowledge. And indigenous knowledge is based on the essence of worldviews. Again, it's a set of values and beliefs stemming from indigenous ways of knowing and being. In the case of indigenous research paradigms, indigenous methodologies honors knowledge, principles, beliefs, and values stemming from indigenous communities. The discrepancy between Western research paradigm and an indigenous research paradigm has been discussed widely, especially in New Zealand since the 70s, when the country was going through the revitalization of knowledge. Maturanga and Maori means knowledge. And most of the scholars that now are well-known scholars, such as Graham Smith, he wrote his thesis entirely on the Kaupapa Maori theory and praxis. Later on, and in the 90s, Linda Smith, she wrote the book, Decolonization Methodologies. Linda Smith articulated her discontent from how research has been conducted with Maori communities and also with other indigenous communities. And she urged us to think about the key components of an indigenous research model. First of all, asking who will benefit from the research and whose interest does it serve. And she even takes it even further in discussions that I had with my colleagues back home in New Zealand. It came at the core of, do you have a good heart when you go and conduct research? Who is going to be writing the research? Who's going to be asking those questions? And that sort of understanding of how research should be conducted when you work with indigenous communities is often overlooked and is not clearly understood in Western academia. Linda Smith started the colonial movement, the colonial project about developing indigenous research frameworks that are more aligned to the ways of acquiring knowledge, to the ways how indigenous peoples value and exchange knowledge. There are other scholars that have supported Linda Smith and other indigenous scholars in their fight to develop alternative research frameworks. For instance, in Latin America, we have Walter Mignolo, we have Gustavo Esteva, we have Tirso Gonzalez. In North America, we have Maggie Kovac, and in Oceania, we have Sean Wilson. I'm drawing from all those indigenous and non-indigenous scholars to develop the Khipu. When it comes to social science discipline, there also has been an improvement, and it also has been a desire to be able to understand indigenous communities, indigenous ways of knowing and being, adopting methods that are more culturally sensitive. In the case of anthropology, we have seen more research conducted through reflexivity and ethnographic lens. In regards to indigenous and ethnic studies, critical race theory has played a key role in understanding the social justice issues happening with indigenous communities. And adopting a participatory research approach and being able to engage scholarship with the purpose of understanding more the ways of knowing and being of communities around the world, centering the best culturally appropriate ways to conduct research. It is within this space, drawing from non-indigenous and indigenous scholars and literature, that I took on the role to develop the Khipu, because I wanted to honor the voices of the ancestors. And in honoring the voices of the ancestors, I decided to use the Khipu. And I use the Khipu as a metaphor, and also because the Khipu until now is one of the most known record-keeping systems invented by indigenous peoples. And I wanted to highlight the knowledge systems. The Khipu, for the ones that don't know much about the Khipu is an Andean record-keeping system developed by the Andean people during the Andean civilization back in the 16th century. And they have the main primary code, and also they have pendants. And in the pendants, they have different notes, different colors, different ways how that are supporting the Khipu. And every single note and all the threads that are supporting the Khipu, they contain different sources of information. And Inca time, they were used to tell about the history of specific community. It was used for accounting purposes, for taxation. Because of the characteristics of the Khipu, and specifically having this main code and as a fundamental basis of holding this body of knowledge, I use it to start framing the Khipu model. And in essence, in a nutshell, the Khipu model highlights Quechua and Maori worldviews. It is an indigenous knowledge-based research framework, highlights Quechua and Maori, and explain more about and giving more examples of why I center these worldviews. So the epistemology, the main code, the one that is across, is based on Quechua and Maori worldviews. It adopts a participatory action research. We are working with and for communities to express evidence, validates knowledge systems, understands that each indigenous group is unique, and each of them represents a wealth body of knowledge. Language is important for indigenous peoples, and it's crucial. It's at the heart of the cultures. And knowledge is shared through language, through metaphors or histories. Additionally, the Khipu is centered on indigenous values and protocols. It draws from the literature of the Kaupapa Maori research framework, and also draws from the Potato Park bioculture protocol in Peru. And in essence, the Khipu provides accountability and responsibility when conducting research with indigenous communities. The framing stage is important. It's a very important stage, because here's when I position the Khipu. The positionality in the Khipu is based on the Quechua and Maori worldviews. Indigenous worldviews are holistic in nature, where every single being, human and non-human, humans and non-humans, when I'm referring to the mountains, the rivers, the sea, all of them work together in a holistic way. Each of them have a key unique role in making sure that the whole environment is working together and is healthy, and thereby provides well-being for the whole of the society. Highlighting the uniqueness of indigenous worldviews, I'm grounding the Khipu model on the Quechua and Maori, and also recognizing that at the core of the worldviews exist knowledge systems, and knowledge systems are important and are unique to these two groups. Also languages, the Khipu acknowledges the transmission of stories. In my case, when I investigated about the food systems of the Quechua and Maori, there were so many metaphors. They use the kumara, for instance, which is a Maori sacred crop, the origins of the kumara, and how they use the kumara to relate to their ancestors. And in the case of Peru, the tradition that they always carry when conducting ceremonies, they have the Quinto ceremony where they grab 3 main coca leaves before each ceremony. The main leader will grab the 3 coca leaves and then will talk to, always facing the east where the sun, and also facing the main mountain. And why she does that to highlight that we're asking permission to all the environment and to allow us to share knowledge in a safe environment. So those protocols and ways how indigenous peoples understand the sharing of knowledge and value of knowledge, it's acknowledged in the Khipu. The Khipu has 3 main threads: ways of knowing, epistemology, ways of being, ontology, which is drawing from the Quechua and Māori worldviews, Kaupapa Māori, Andean biocultural, and ways of doing, related to ethical principles and related to how this model will inform the best methods to conduct research with indigenous communities. So now I'll explain you in depth about the knowing stage. I'm grounding, this is the main quote, I'm grounding the methodology on Quechua Māori worldviews. As I mentioned to you, it's holistic. Every single organism and living being works together to honor the voices of ancestors, to honor the land. An example is about the uniqueness of the Quechua Māori worldviews is the understanding of the land. When I was conducting interviews and I was working with them, I asked, what do you think of the land? And they told me, on the Quechua side, land is our mother. It's Pachamama, Mother Earth. Similarly, in New Zealand, the answers were Papa Tunuku, or Mother Earth, is my mother. And I am Tangata Whenua, which means I am the peoples of the land. So here, I came to understand that the concept of land is ingrained in the Quechua Māori worldviews, and it shapes the worldviews and shapes how they conduct themselves and how they use their worldviews and knowledge and connection with the land and the whole environment for agricultural practices and to preserve knowledge. When we talk about knowledge in the epistemology and the origins of knowledge, the Khipu validates traditional ecological knowledge that highlights that every single indigenous group, every single community will have their own unique knowledge system. In the case of the Quechua, to give you an example, the knowledge system of different food production, the different techniques that they use, the plowing of the land, the selection of the seeds. And in the case of the Maori people, the knowledge is embedded in the spiritualism and how they conduct rituals and ceremonies for the growing and harvesting of the food crops. So we can see different experiences when it comes to knowledge emerging from these 2 indigenous worldviews. And the way how Quechua Māori acquire knowledge and disseminate knowledge is through a collectivistic approach. They work together in the land, they talk to one another. It's a very collectivistic society, and they learn by doing. So participatory action research where communities, I was working with communities, and for communities, is at the core of the Khipu model. So now we have the knowing stage, which is epistemology. Every single thread is together. They work together. They're interrelated, interconnected. One helps and informs the other. In this case, the knowing is supporting ontology, ways of being, Quechua Māori worldviews, traditional ecological knowledge. And here I'm drawing from the Kaupapa Māori research. Kaupapa Māori research, it's a Māori-centric research framework. And how my colleagues in New Zealand told me to understand that It is done by Maori, with Maori, and for Maori. But it doesn't mean that we can't use the same principles and the same concept of the Kaupapa Maori when we develop an indigenous research framework. In this case, this research is done with Quechua Maori people, by Quechua Maori people, and for Quechua Maori people. The Khipu provides the setting of self-determination of Quechua Maori to guide the understanding of what are the best research methods for me to use. At this stage, I was already in discussions with both the Quechua Maori when it comes to what sort of questions I would like you to ask, or vice versa. In this stage, I was already in discussions about what's the topic of my research, what research is needed, as opposed to me coming with the idea that there is an issue here, there is a food security issue. My approach was, I want to hear your stories. I want to know about what are the pressing concerns that you're facing, water issues, food security, land rights issues. And they all expressed concerns about food security, and how I started building up my own research project. Kaupapa Maori has main key principles. I'm drawing from the principle of ATA. ATA talks about the growing of respectful relationships. When it comes to research, I'm growing respectful relationships with the study communities, with the participants. And they're also, at that stage, they're thinking about where they actually want to share knowledge with me, or they don't want to share knowledge with me. The principle of ACO is a pedagogical technique that helps us to build up respectful relationships. An example is when I go to the communities and we start discussing about food productions or about specific indigenous crops. It is just not me learning or they learning from me. We're learning from one another, and we're developing and building up knowledge together. And when it comes to the Andean Biocultural Protocol, here I have to say that in New Zealand we have established research framework, which is the Kaupapa Maori. And in Peru, there is no such thing. There is no established research framework. The closest to our indigenous research framework, it's the Andean Biocultural Protocol, based on the Kaupapa Maori. It grabs some and takes into consideration the main principle of the Kaupapa Maori, which is being able to acknowledge sovereignty, autonomy of indigenous peoples to be able to help us and work together as research partners in the research. And also reciprocity, which is similar to the principle of ACO, building reciprocal relationships when we're in the field. All these components, and I'm drawing from this from literature of the Kaupapa Maori and the Andean Biocultural Protocol, to also build up the ethical principles. When it comes to ethical principles in New Zealand, the rigor of research is different to the rigor of research in Peru. When it comes to the code of ethics, I even had to, because there is no such research framework in Peru, and it's different, I had to be able to provide an affidavit to the University of Auckland to say that I'm going to conduct in the best possible ethical way, and I'm going to acknowledge the Andean cultural norms and protocols to be able to be at equal terms with the Maori research framework. This is just to show you the rigor of research and ethical principles that are in New Zealand comparable to Peru. The Kaupapa Maori approach, as I mentioned, embodies how research should be conducted with Maori communities, but does not stop you from adopting those principles when it comes to other communities like I did. I'm drawing from these frameworks and the ways of knowing and ways of being of Quechua Maori people has guided me to develop and use the best research methods for my research with the Quechua Maori. I acknowledge storytelling most of the conversation in the knowledge production and knowledge sovereignty that happened in the field and throughout my interviews were in the form of metaphors, storytelling, and structured interviews, because I gave them the freedom to tell me whatever information they wanted to tell me. And talking circles. And you might think, what's the difference between this and ethnographic research? The main difference is that the Khipu model highlights the cultural norms and protocols and centers the research on indigenous worldviews. It's centering the research not on a Western research paradigm, but on an indigenous research paradigm, which permeates and transcends all throughout the research framework. And now I want to tell you how they helped me to be able to collect the data in Quechua and Maori communities. The Khipu model has led me to go to the highlands of Peru, to Cusco. I was working with 4 Quechua communities in the region of Cusco and in Lares. I had a great time working with them because they built a relationship that took a period of 6 to 7 years. While it's even now, it's still ongoing. And every time I go, and it's something that's important as well when in indigenous research frameworks, accountability, be accountable for the research, being able to go back there and share the findings. Maybe I should go back here. By the end, when I had the research methods, and I already had the workshops and talking circles, I was consulting with them at every single stage, just to make sure the research was conducted how they wanted me to be done. That I was telling the story as, I was telling the story as seen through an indigenous lens, and honoring the voices of the ancestors. Here I'm in the highlands of Peru. Similarly, in New Zealand, I conducted my research in the North Island of the country and 4 iwi or tribes. And again, it's been great and fabulous to be able to work with them and feel honored that they share the knowledge with me. And I still go back and share the findings, what sort of other information they want to share with me, and also what's the benefit of my research for them. One of the benefits is that being able to understand how knowledge production is acquired in Peru about the seeds and seed sovereignty, and how we can build up knowledge with Quechua communities. Here are some examples of the participatory action research. I conducted preliminary workshops with both study communities prior, during, and after. I conducted workshops at the end because I went back to validate my findings. Here are some examples of, these are the early 2014, 2016, and these are the most recent pictures when I went back last year. Again, to provide them with the final product, the chapters of my book, I acknowledge the knowledge. I'm still working with them. And again, the principle of working with and for indigenous communities is clearly articulated in the Khipu model. The Khipu highlights Quechua Māori worldviews, the building of reciprocal relationships, reflectivity, accountability, which is key, and responsibility. Similarly here with the Maori communities, again, it's early pictures, it's 2011, 2014. I went back to visit this amazing Maori scholar who's been unwell. So Kiri Kark has been great in providing me valuable information about Maori people, and I went back to talk to her about the findings and how we are being able to connect Maori ancestors with Quechua ancestors and the knowledge that has been produced. And this is a picture with them last year. I'm still working when it comes to food sovereignty, food security issues with them. Responsibility is key for the Khipu because I have a role, not just as a researcher, but as an indigenous researcher, to go back to the communities and tell the story, to retell the story, because there are many stories that have been told about them that are not correct. So my job, and the job of other indigenous researchers, is to retell the story are seen through an indigenous lens, highlighting indigenous worldviews, highlighting the ways of knowing and being, and producing a model that supports, as I mentioned, the group of scholars, indigenous and non-indigenous, that are working towards building up frameworks that are more in resonance with indigenous people's ways of acquiring knowledge, exchanging knowledge, and valuing knowledge. Another thing that I like to mention here is that the Khipu not only helped me to develop this indigenous research methodology, but also articulated an indigenous political theory of self-determination, because it allowed me to give voices to indigenous communities to be able to tell and retell their stories, and also support social justice, because the Khipu model is a model that can be used in other communities. It's a model that can be adapted, it can be improved for the study of communities in a more culturally sensitive manner. And with that, kia ora, sulpaki, and thank you. And now we have more time for questions where I actually get more satisfaction about, so I can explain more about the Khipu.